Welcome everybody to the virtual panel discussion, Sanctions in Science, 1 year of sanctions, which is organized by the Science4Peace Forum together with the Naturwissenschaftler innen initiative and the Wissenschaft Frieden, Science and Peace journal in Germany. The Science4Peace Forum started as a discussion forum of scientists after 24th February 2022, where all official contacts from some science institution to Russian and Belarusian institutes and scientists were put on hold. At DESY was said, new publications with participation of Russian and Belarusian institutions will be suspended, and DESY employees will not participate in conferences where speakers from Russian or Belarusian institutes are announced. This made it necessary to establish an independent forum where we can still communicate and talk to each other. The Science4Peace Forum has launched a petition, Stop the Escalation Spiral, to research institutions and big laboratories protesting against the sometimes too harsh restrictions in science communication. In December 2022, the No First Use, Never Any Use of Nuclear Weapons appeal, together with 14 Nobel laureates, was launched and is still open for signatures. If you are interested, please sign this appeal. The panel discussion is structured in the following way. We first will discuss sanctions in general, then we will discuss sanctions in science, and the most important thing, the ways out of the present situation. After that, there will be option for questions from the audience. The whole panel discussion will be recorded and it will be made available on the Science4Peace webpage as well as on our Science4Peace Forum YouTube channel. Comments and questions during the in the chat during the panel discussion will not be answered, but we will have a general discussion at the end. If you want to get in contact with the Science4Peace Forum, please use the contact address on the webpage. Now, David from the Science and Peace journal will say a few welcome words. Please, David.
Just a few introductory words from Wissenschaft Frieden. So Wissenschaft Frieden is a journal that from its inception 40 years ago has always been at the forefront of bringing peace research, peace movement, and the politics of peace together in a fruitful discussion. And I think the question of sanctions has been a contentious one, at least in the last year, but always some of you might remember discussions about sanctions in the food for oil program and or around the Iraqi war and or when it comes to Yugoslavia. So now we are in a big discussion about sanctions again, and I think their impacts and their sort of hopeful sort of connections, and on the other hand the detriments they might bring, are very much a topic that we need to debate. And now that even science and research in general is also sort of part of the sanction packages, this also brings in a whole new debate in this. So we're really thrilled that this discussion is going on today, and Wissenschaft Frieden has always sort of opened a forum for these discussions, and we're really happy to basically spring into the 21st century with this Peace Forum here now, since these kinds of virtual debates we've not been doing in the last few years. So this is also our welcome to the 21st century, and we're really happy to be part of this. Let's see, perhaps some of the speakers' remarks may find their way in one of the next issues of the journal. I'm really looking forward to this discussion today, and yeah, I'm really happy that we have this amazing panel of so many speakers here today. Thank you, Hannes, for organizing all this, and yeah. Over to you again, and then into our great panel.
Thanks a lot, David, for these nice words. I'm now happy to introduce John Ellis, the chair of the panel. John Ellis is professor of theoretical physics at King's College in London, and he's member of the theory division at CERN in Geneva. He was twice deputy division leader of the theory division and served as a division leader from 1988 to 1994. He has more than 1,000 scientific papers as a co-author, which is remarkable for a theorist. And John Ellis was a CERN advisor for non-member state relations and is known very well for his efforts to involve non-European nations into the CERN scientific activities. And he has been especially involved in relations with Russia, Ukraine, and Serbia. John is also an active member of the Science4Peace Forum, and he will chair and lead the panel discussion today. So John, I hand over to you for the panel discussion. Please.
Okay, thanks very much, Hannes, for that introduction. Thanks also for the invitation to try to moderate this discussion. Look forward to a very lively debate. So I thought that I would follow the suggestion of Hannes to divide the debate into several sections. So we'll start off with a little bit of a historical background on science and sanctions in general, then discuss specifically sanctions in science, both in physics and in other areas of science. Then at the end, we'll have a sort of general debate amongst the panelists about the future and ways out. Well, I hope there's no way out from the future, but I hope there's a way out of the current situation in the future. So what I thought I would do would be to introduce the panelists in groups of three, according to the parts of the debate that Hannes proposed that they might wish to intervene. So the first part of the debate concerns the historical role of sanctions, what sanctions were successful, what were not successful, what are the legal aspects. Is there a reason why sanctions in science, culture, and sport are needed? And why are sanctions extended to science? So I think it's a set of very basic questions about sanctions. And the panelists who are invited to respond to these questions are Michal Brzoska. So Michal is affiliated with the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy in Hamburg, and he's still very active there as a senior research fellow. So Michal, if you just wave your hand just to show who you are. Thank you. Then also participating in this part of the debate, we have Clara Portela. So she's from the Faculty of Law at the University of Valencia, and she teaches political science at the law school there. Previously, she was in Singapore, research fellow with the European Union for Institute for Security Studies in Paris, and her research focuses on multilateral sanctions. So she's certainly an expert on the topic that we're going to be discussing. So Clara, say wave hello to people. Thank you. And then the third panelist in this part of the discussion is Gertz Neuneck. So he's co-chair of the Federation of German Scientists, which was founded in 1959. And he was also affiliated with the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. And he's a professor of the Faculty of Mathematics, Informatics, and Natural Sciences at the same university. And he's also a member of the Council of Pugwash. So I invite the three of you, Michael, Clara, and Gertz, to discuss with us a little bit of the historical role of sanctions, legal aspects, and why politics comes into sanctions in science. Maybe Clara, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. So it's actually quite a broad range of questions that we have to address in this panel. So I actually find that the most interesting aspect here is that sanctions rarely target directly science. So we have actually few examples in which science have been explicitly targeted by a sanctions regime. And I think that the most obvious example, and also an example that is pretty recent and that probably most of us can remember, have to do with the sanctions imposed against Iran. Now, because the Iran sanctions that were imposed starting from 2006, originally by the United Nations and later reinforced by the European Union and obviously also by the US, because they were addressing a problem of a proliferation, of nuclear proliferation, everything that would have, so to say, promoted or aided the development of a nuclear program from a scientific point of view was forbidden, and this included students. This actually affected students who were pursuing their studies overseas, basically in Western countries. So, I mean, to me, this is one of the most obvious cases in which scientific activity was directly targeted. And I think that in the case of the current sanctions regime, even though every member state on Russia, even though every member state has adopted this policy of stopping cooperation with research institutes in Russia and in Belarus, the concrete implementation of this measure has been different in different member states, because being one of the few panelists who is based outside Germany, or more specifically in Spain, my university severed cooperation with institutional cooperation links with research institutes and universities in Russia. But we don't actually face restrictions when it comes to cooperating with Russian co-authors, as long as each of us do not involve directly our universities in this activity. So it looks like the implementation of this specific measure has also experienced some variation, or is experiencing some variation in different member states. But actually, because the type of sanctions that are imposed nowadays tends to be targeted, with the exception of a case like Iran, where there was a direct link between the motive for the imposition of sanctions and the reasons, the scientific activities or studies that some individuals were conducting. Normally, science should be only marginally affected, or should only suffer collateral damage from sanctions, precisely because the policy that Western senders have been following over the past decades has consisted precisely in identifying who were the individuals responsible for the wrongdoing or for the condemned action, and trying to affect those individuals who were normally members of the political elite or military elite, or in some cases also religious elites. But the idea was really to spare the population as a whole from the effects of sanctions. So scientists as such normally would not appear on blacklists that forbid the transfer of funds, or the freezing of assets, or the entry into the territory of European member states.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's basically what I can say by way of introduction. So perhaps somebody else can pick up from here.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Clara. I think you raised some very interesting points there. Speaking from the perspective of CERN, actually, we were able to maintain our collaboration with Iran despite the sanctions that were being imposed around the world. But of course, in the case of Russia and Belarus, things are much more complicated, but maybe we'll come back to that later. I know, Mikhail, would you like to follow on from Clara?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to start off maybe with picking up what was said earlier in the introduction, namely that sanctions are a highly contentious issue. And that is mostly because they are a highly political instrument. There's a debate about legal aspects. There's a clear legal foundation in the UN Charter, but beyond that, it's really a matter of governments. And also, as we have seen now again in the case of Russia sanctions, also some cases private actors, although in international relations, I wouldn't call that legitimate sanctions, but of course we see that private institutions do also mandate restrictive measures, which in effect are like sanctions. But of course, they are not of the political nature of sanctions that are mandated by governments. Beyond the UN sanctions, all other sanctions are based on either national law or based on multilateral organizations such as the European Union. And they are political instruments. They are political decisions whether they are mandated or not. And the legal aspects also often very obscure or debated, let's say it. A case in point is human rights law. We have had a lot of sanctions mandated, for instance, by the European Union, which have been challenged in courts because of the human rights implications, and in some cases had to be withdrawn. One can make a case, of course, with respect to sanctions on science, that they are in conflict with, for instance, German constitutional law. That is something that courts could test and where they could have a view on. But sanctions themselves are a political measure which cannot be challenged really in court. That's my first point. The second point is that because they are political measures, they have a wide range of causes and applications. A colleague of ours has divided them into three. Sanctions can coerce. That's a point that Clara already made, that they can be, the objective of sanctions can be to put pressure on individuals that made some decisions that those who sanctioned don't like, to change those decisions. They can constrain in the sense of limiting the opportunity of the target to do certain things, for instance, arms embargoes, aiming at reducing the capability of targeted entities to conduct warfare. But in practice, very often sanctions are symbolic. That means they are not really aimed at either constraining or coercing, but to signal something, to signal discontent. Signal discontent not only to the targeted entities, but also to, for instance, the people in the country that mandates the sanctions, arguing we do something, we are doing something against what we don't like, and we're doing more than just saying it's bad, we're doing something substantial, and also targeting the wider world by saying, okay, this is behavior that's not acceptable, it's against international law, it's against international norms, we have to do something about that. My reason saying that this kind of signaling probably is the most important objective of sanctions is that if you look at the effectiveness of sanctions with respect to coercing and constraining targets, it's fairly low. Particularly the coerce element is, depending on how you define it, only happening in a few cases. Constraint maybe more often, but most sanctions really only are symbolic in the sense that they're not really doing something substantial with respect to the target. Still, they are very important. And I think when we talk about the recent sanctions on science today, they are mostly there because of their symbolic value. That, like in other fields, like in sports and culture, after the beginning of the Russian attack in Ukraine, there was a general trend to say, okay, don't cooperate with Russians at all, don't talk to any Russian. And that science has been subject to that kind of feeling, but that there's very little support for either saying that there's coercing or constraining elements of scientific sanctions.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. I think you've raised some very interesting points. in English, we have an expression of kicking the cat when we're discontented with our spouses. And maybe that's what's happening to scientists in the current situation. Okay, so Götz, is there some point that you'd like to raise in this context?
Thank you, John, for introducing me. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this virtual panel here on a very important subject. Let me use the precious time to make three points. The first is my view of the role of science as such, which already touches the next session. Then the role of science, of sanctions and science, especially from the point of the war in the Ukraine. And third, I think it is important to articulate what actually scientists can do in this actually polarizing and daunting situation. From my perspective, modern sciences are rooted in humanism and progress for all, and its main principles are objectivity, rational reasoning, international exchange, and we should not be naive. This is always in danger. So scientists stick on the freedom and liberty of science and scientists, but the realities could become different. So this is not new. Let me remind you that today is the International Day of Human Spaceflight, and that was Yuri Gagarin going to space as the first man. The UN resolution says, as a high aspiration, reaffirming this important contribution of space science and technology in achieving sustainable development goals and increasing the well-being of states and people, as well as ensuring the realization of their aspiration to maintain outer space for peaceful purposes. So the peaceful purposes are mostly in the minds of scientists if they do their work. But that is, of course, challenged. In history, we had international years, the International Geophysical Year in *57, CERN and DESY have been founded as international cooperational projects, ISS, ITER, SESAME, all these are important bridge building processes. And we need international cooperation also to get more insight and work on big threats such as the climate change. Let me quote Victor Weisskopf, who said in 1969, the scientific community serves as a bridge across boundaries, as a spearhead of international understanding. But this is one side of the coin. And of course, sanctions hurt these aspirations. And in so far, Clara and Michael made the right point as specialists on sanctions, that sanctions nevertheless are used as a political instrument, whether they're seen and their implications are seen as only symbolic or doing really damage, then has to be decided by responsible persons. I'm not in the political field. I'm not a politician, and I'm also not a scientist. So I think scientists have to make the assessment what the implications of scientific sanctions are. But on the other side, scientists should not be too naive. Science is not only for international cooperation. It is also a competitive enterprise on glory, prestige, national funds, and also in extreme cases, scientific results can be misused for military purposes. We should not forget that, and this discloses the ambivalence of science. Political neutrality, which is one fundament of science, is not easy to achieve in a world of situation as we have now here on the European continent. And we see also new fields of applications here. emerging where science, intelligence, advanced material sciences, all these are not only for humanity as such, but they're also used by nations and by states. And we should also have in mind that these future applications which could come out of science are not sacrosanct. The ambivalent nature of scientific knowledge will always exist and can only be mitigated by preventive measures, dialogue, technological assessment, arms control regulations. And insofar, science is not only in general free. And as several political documents show, the scientific community is more and more challenged by the new geopolitical rivalry between these so-called superpowers, Russia, China, the United States. And one example is a new arms race going on between these superpowers, but I don't have the time. And this is not the key issue here of this panel. My third point is the war in the Ukraine, and this has not only triggered far-reaching economic sanctions by the EU and other countries against Russia and Belarus, but also led to a freeze of official cooperations with scientific state institutions in Russia and Belarus, at the same time supporting much more the Ukrainian science, which was not so much in the focus of many countries before that. In the long run, this can also affect and poison, by the way, the relationship with Chinese institutions. So there's an alliance, political alliance between Russia and China, and reactions from the side can be expected in the future, and that makes a severe and deep dialogue between scientists and these countries even more necessary, I would argue. Of course, sanctions in science are never good, either for scientists themselves or for scientific progress as such. It is also true for the war itself. There are many losers on both sides. Nevertheless, the war happens and the sanctions are there. So the question is indeed what to do in this situation. It is often said that these sanctions, EU sanctions, are not focusing on individuals, but the effects and the collateral damage are the individuals. And I nevertheless would like to encourage all scientists to talk with their Russian counterparts about the origin, the implications, and possible solutions for this bloody war in the Ukraine. In your introduction, you pointed that I'm the German PAKVOSH representative, and I'm also a member of the PAKVOSH Council. And this leads me to my last part. What can scientists do? And the PAKVOSH conferences have for decades showed that it is not only possible, but absolutely necessary to talk with the other side in a confidential way, even on political issues. There are many examples in the PAKVOSH history where it was possible to organize a structured dialogue with colleagues in the East Bloc or even in the Middle East, even during a war-like situation. We should not forget that. The Vietnam War.
Excuse me, Gert.
Sorry?
I think that's a point that we can come back to in the discussion towards the end.
Okay.
We're discussing the way forward. So.
Okay, let me finish by saying that we should seize the opportunity, even in this very daunting and awful situation, to talk with each other. I mean, there are other examples, scientific assessments, analysis. We should not throw away arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. These are important issues, and they form a basis to talk about future implications between our countries. Education in a changing environment is important. And let me, at the end again, quote Viktor Weisskopf, who said in 1969, "Scientists understand each other immediately when they talk about their scientific problems. And it is thus easier for them to speak to each other on political or cultural questions and problems about which they may have divergent opinions." So again, this dialogue is necessary, and we should not build or use sanctions to cut these important channel of conversation and dialogue. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Gus. I think you really raised some very important points there, and some of them we'll be coming back to later on. Climate change, I think also relations with China, something we should be discussing later on, and also a topic that's been discussed by a couple of you is the impact on younger scientists. But I think now we should move on and discuss concretely the sanctions that are now being applied to Russia and Belarusian institutes, scientists. And I think it's worth emphasizing again, as has already stated, that policies differ from country to country, maybe even from institutes to institutes, that LHC experiments at CERN really tied themselves in knots, trying to find a way of continuing to collaborate with Russian and Belarusian scientists while respecting the political constraints imposed by the CERN Council. And other collaborations, scientific collaborations, have followed different policies. Anyway, now we have Michelle, Natasha, and Sasha to talk about these issues. And I think I'll invite Natasha first.
Hello. So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank to the organizers for inviting me to be a panelist and giving me a chance to say something about this rather complex question, which is very pronounced in the field I'm working in. It's particle physics and big international scientific collaborations. I'm coming from Montenegro, which is a part of former Yugoslavia, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was under embargo and sanctions from United Nations Security Council because of interference in civil war in Bosnia. And here I would take some time to tell you how CERN conducted the sanctions towards Yugoslav scientists in that time. So the sanctions from United Nations took action in 1992. It banned all possible exchange and cooperation, internal trade, technical and scientific cooperation, sports and culture, air and nautical travel, and also travel of governmental staff from the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Our country, the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, actually had been one of the 12 founding countries of CERN in 1950s. It left this organization in 1961, and in the time when sanctions took place, had the status of observer to CERN Council. Although CERN presented itself as an open institution carrying out fundamental research in particle physics and promoting international scientific cooperation in non-political spirit, CERN actually announced that they will not ignore the anonymous will of the international community. For that reason, CERN had adopted the United Nations embargo against Yugoslavia promptly. The details how CERN reacted at that time I found in the official site. So the embargo was taking place and was announced on May 30th, 1992, and already on 10th of June 1992, Director General of CERN informed all the representatives of foreign affairs of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and its Geneva mission that CERN will fully comply with the United Nations resolution, and the delegates from Yugoslavia were no longer invited to any of the organization's official meetings. So CERN took all the measures to run down the activities of cooperation with Serbia and Montenegro. For example, all data communications using computer networks were shut down. There were no scientific materials sent from CERN to Yugoslavia or vice versa. And after embargo was announced, no CERN personnel had visited Yugoslavia. Also, CERN decided not to enforce the agreements of scientific cooperation it had signed in 1989 and in 1991, and had consequently discontinued all cooperation with scientific institutions from Serbia and Montenegro. These sanctions lasted for about 3 years. Now, as a team leader of my group, I'm a member of the collaboration board of the big international scientific collaboration, working at CMS, Experiment and CERN, where we had very long discussions trying to find the best, not really the best, but let's say the most decent way to apply the sanctions toward our colleagues from Russia and Belarus, which lasted for about a year. And at the end, after secret voting, they were kind of compromises between several sides who had the strongest feelings, I would say, towards the sanctions. So in the situation of this war in Ukraine, I would say CERN has not taken so sharp actions toward our colleagues from Russia and Belarus. I would actually say that CERN had amortized the actions as long as they could, and we could actually see that there was a lot of opinion exchange in the council itself and also between the collaborations. I think that appeals from scientists, and especially from this forum, Science4Peace, had actually played an important role for the sanctions not to be so severe as they were in the 90s in the case of Yugoslavia. Of course, it cannot be compared. The impact, contribution, and presence of Russian scientists and institutions at CERN was much more significant than the Yugoslav ones. And so when we talk about the effect of those sanctions, I remember how it was in Yugoslavia in that time. The sanctions put our country in a very difficult situation. The inflation was dramatic on a daily basis. Monthly salary were around of 5 to 10 German marks. Concerning the sanctions in science, they had a really huge effect in our science. We really had no groups in international scientific collaborations, and it took quite some time to rebuild it and start joining international collaborations again. Yeah. I can say that at that time it was extremely difficult especially for young people to work in science. They could not train in international scientific centers and cooperate with the leading scientists, could not join international schools. And as we all know, it is a big limitation and handicap for a young person who wants to develop and work in science.
Well, thank you very much for that testimony, Natasha. I think we've already had some comment on the effects on young scientists in particular. It's perhaps worth remembering that Serbia is now a full member state of CERN. So in some sense, there's been some reconciliation. And we also have active collaboration with Montenegro, which I hope will grow. And your participation in CMS is a testimonial to that.
We came back.
Yeah, good to see you back. So, Sasha, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, sure, I can pick up on Natasha's part. Yes, I mean, in 2 words, what sanctions do for science in high energy physics in particular. So these are mostly harmful for every side, I think. So I mean, let's consider how these large collaborations operate. So I think a lot of people connected are from high energy physics, but not everybody. So I mean, we have large groups of people from all countries. I'm talking about CERN experiments, or I'm personally right now more active in the BELLE collaboration, which is in Japan. So we have about 1,000 collaborators, and they are from all countries, from all around the world. And there is a chapter in the collaboration, so it's using as much open policy. So there is open publications policy, open source as much as possible, and software. We also publish our software open source, so full openness. And suddenly we are in the situation that we have to break connections and relations So yeah, obviously everyone was shocked at the beginning with the start of the war, but I have to say the first reaction was from Russian collaborators. They were immediately taking shifts from the Ukrainians and immediately opposing what was going on in the country. So I think the sanctions are for certain, indiscriminate sanctions are basically harmful. That's my main point here. And obviously they are harmful for the collaboration in general. And so the difficulty is how to deal with that. So as Jones and others said, the reaction in different countries is pretty different. Obviously, in Ukraine, there is a very strong position that that's a way for them to fight Russia is to also refuse any communication with Russians. And this is very much understandable. And BELLE has a few collaborators from Ukraine. And obviously, if they refuse signing papers with the rest, this is not good at all. So you have to find a solution which is acceptable for everybody. So that's just on the kind of on a human level. And of course, there are this is an ideal world in which we live. So openness, open access, and so on. But everything costs money. These are expensive experiments. So they are connected to everything must be funded by funding agencies, and here comes the politics, obviously. And again, different countries react differently. Some of them are very strong. So okay, but BELLE took an initiative, and there is a solution how it was possible to unlock publications of the papers which would be signed by everybody. The solution is not ideal, but it's at least uniform, so it's not discriminating against the people. So essentially, authors are signing with their ID number, and agencies which support the scientists are not listed. The affiliations are not listed for the scientists. Okay, so the ways forward we will discuss later on, I guess. So I think this is what I want to say for myself.
Okay, thank you very much, Sasha. So as you say, as has been said previously, different countries have different policies, and I think CERN has had great difficulty in navigating its way through pressures pushing in various different directions. So now I'd like to call on Michel Spiro, who is a former chair of the CERN Council, who's been able to see this firsthand, and is currently president of IUPAP. So what better expert than to talk to us about the international political pressures. Michel.
Thank you, John. Yes, I will report on the position of IUPAP, the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, which, as you said, I am president, the position on the sanctions in science. So first, I have to recall so IUPAP has a long tradition of science for peace. I want to recall first the critically important historical role that IUPAP has always strived to play in bringing physicists together across political divides, even during our most difficult years in the past. During the Cold War, no one alluded to the Cold War, but during the Cold War, this was already very difficult times. IUPAP did what was possible at that time to maintain contacts with physicists in the former USSR. So in that spirit, today, despite the recent Russian military offensive or invasion of Ukraine and the terrible consequences that this had on the lives of our colleagues in Ukraine. Despite we extended our deepest sympathy and solidarity to them and to all the Ukrainian people at this difficult time. Despite that in solidarity, we admitted Ukraine as a new member of IUPAP, IUPAP continues to embrace and promote scientific collaboration across the world as a driver for peace. It will be inappropriate for IUPAP to bar any scientists, especially from a member nation, Russia is a member nation, from any scientific activity, to bar any scientist from any scientific activity. As long as the work upholds the ethics and principles of science in its highest ideals, for example, does not actively support war, IUPAP sees no reason to disallow participation of Russian scientists in the affairs of the Union, and you have Russian scientists at the top level of the Union, and also in IUPAP-sponsored conferences, which, by the way, is the main activity of IUPAP. A compromise was found to cope with the present sanctions, which is that their participation, the participation of the Russian or Belarusian physicists in the IUPAP-sponsored conference be with a neutral IUPAP affiliation. For instance, for the IUPAP very global sponsored INPC 2022, which is the International Nuclear Physics Conference, where many Russian physicists attended in South Africa, all participants, including, as I said, many Russian physicists, wore a neutral IUPAP affiliation. More generally, IUPAP-sponsored conferences have to be open to scientists from all countries. And IUPAP funding is there to help scientists from less developed countries to attend these IUPAP-sponsored conferences. We help also less developed countries to host IUPAP conferences. And finally, I will finish with that. We strongly recommend also that schools for PhD students be exempted of any sanction. I take the example of the CERN GINR Dubna school, which happened in the past and which was stopped this time due to the sanction. We are trying to get this school re-established, even allowing you to be under the auspices of IUPAP. So I think with that, I more or less summarize the position of IUPAP on the sanctions. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you very much, Michel. I think there's a couple of interesting points that have arisen from what you and others have said. One is that during the Cold War, connections between the West and Soviet physicists were, of course, maintained. And in fact, the Soviet Union actually initiated its collaboration with CERN in the middle of the Cold War. And physicists went from CERN to the Soviet Union to participate in experiments there. It wasn't a one-way street, it was a two-way street. And it was in part due to these exchanges that the Pugwash movement got started back in the day. So I personally am very relieved at the fact that the compromise that was finally arrived at for the CERN collaborations, which was, as was said, I think, by Natasha, or maybe it was Sasha, was taken as a result of a vote amongst the participating institutions, that individual Russians, signed the papers, and they sign with their ORCID IDs so that you can find out where they come from and find out more details of their scientific biographies. The thing which got stuck was that many member states of CERN, and hence many participating institutions in the big collaborations, could not accept a co-sign with Russian institutions that had expressed their support for the war. And so that's why in the case of the CERN collaborations, people from those Russian and Belarusian institutions are listed as coming from an institution which is covered by a cooperation agreement with CERN, rather than having the actual name of the institute. Finally, I would just like also to echo something which you said, Michelle, and it's been said by others, the impact on the young scientists and in particular schools. And I also very much regret the fact that the CERN Dubna schools, which I participated in setting up back in the 1990s, are paused for the time being, and that Russian students are no longer welcome in the CERN summer student program. And I think this is a severe mistake.
Yes.
Okay. Maybe we move on now to discuss the situation in other fields of science, in particular climate research, medicine, and health science. And for that, I'd like to welcome, in the first place, Chuck Johnson, who is Program Director of the Institute of Physicists for Preventing Nuclear War, and has had many years of experience coordinating the Federation's work, educating world leaders on medical and humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Chuck.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Hannes, and everyone for organizing this forum. Yeah, our organization, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, was founded in 1980 with the purpose of establishing direct communication among medical professionals across the political divide of the Cold War. And it actually spun out of conversations that were initiated between Bernard Lown, a renowned cardiologist from Harvard, and Yevgeny Chazov, who also was a cardiologist and the personal physician of Brezhnev and other Soviet leaders, that the rhetoric between the United States and the Soviet Union of surviving nuclear war and threatening each other with nuclear weapons and threatening the world with nuclear weapons was far too dangerous to ignore as medical professionals, that they knew that the concept that surviving nuclear war that was being promoted with bomb shelters and planning and so forth was false, that no one can win nuclear war. It would be a healthcare disaster, and the only proper medical response would be prevention. So on that basis, 3 Soviet and 3 US doctors met in Geneva and agreed that politics would be set aside and just the medical and health effects of nuclear war would be discussed and put forth to the leaders of the both sides of the Cold War and also to the general publics. And over time, in fact, the Russian government, or excuse me, the Soviet government allowed IPPNW a 2-hour broadcast of the health effects of nuclear war that had an enormous impact inside the Soviet Union. And the IPPNW doctors were able to meet directly with President Reagan and have an impact on his thinking about survivability of nuclear war, which changed over time. And so for the work that we did, we ended up forming affiliates. We're international federation, but we have affiliates at this point in 55 countries, but at one time we had over 70 countries involved. We received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. So the point that we made at the time, and that we continue to make, and we still have Russian and to a lesser degree Ukrainian, but we've maintained Russian affiliate. We have a vice president from Russia, Olga Mironova, who is the granddaughter of Chazov. And we are continuing up until the threat of the Russian invasion. Olga was a chair of a webinar that we held, War in Eastern Europe on the Brink of Humanitarian Disaster, which we had 5 days before the Russian invasion. We've continued to have communication with the Russian Academy of Sciences. James Muller, who was one of the co-founders of IPPNW, addressed the Russian Academy of Sciences 3 weeks after the invasion had begun in Russian, and called for a halt to fighting, withdrawal of troops, and the agreement that no side would use nuclear weapons in the conflict, and was extremely well received. He had been, planning to address the academy, the Russian Academy, already on topic of medicine and exchanges in medicine, but he ended up using his time for that. And the president of the Russian Academy urged him to get back to the US National Academy of Sciences and suggest that they join them in a joint statement along the lines of what Dr. Muller had put out. Unfortunately, Dr. Muller received a very dismissive reply from the president of the US National Academy of Sciences, which had already cut off contact with the Russian Academy. And they basically said, we're not interested in doing anything jointly with the Russian Academy. And this was a huge mistake in our opinion, because there was a lot, I don't know if all of you are aware, but and probably most of you are in this forum, that there were large petitions circulated in academia in Russia that were signed by hundreds, thousands of scientists in opposition to the invasion of Ukraine. And if we could have had common cause at that point, it might have had an impact. But so this is the kind of thing that we lose when we just blanket cut off contact between warring parties. And it's the sort of thing that we need to have a discussion like the one we're having right now within all of the societies that have almost reflexively now at this point begun to just decided that the most effective thing that everyone can do is to shun a country that's done something wrong, which if applied to the United States when we'd invaded Iraq, would have been unfortunate for US scientists, I would say. And with that, I think I'll wrap up so that we have room to have further discussion. But this is a really important forum, and I hope that we can carry these ideas forward throughout the world, and particularly in the West, where I think we need to be thinking more clearly about what sanctions are useful and what ones are detrimental. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Chuck, and thanks again for reminding us that at least some countries in the West are applying policies which are completely opposite to what they did during the Cold War. Okay, maybe Jürgen, you're a professor of geography, you're an expert in climate change. Perhaps you'd like to give a perspective from the point of view of climate science.
Yes, thank you very much for this very important timely event. And I think many of the important questions and answers have been already addressed. My point is more to the question of how under difficult geopolitical constellations we can use science as an instrument for international collaboration, even in conflict situations. So use basically cooperation as an instrument to weaken conflict. And that could be the case for areas of research which contribute to a better world, which is basically one of the main purposes of science and scientists, is to contribute to a better world. Not all doing this, I know this, because of the ambivalence and dual use issues that have been raised, but we should focus on those that are really beneficial to all sides, and particularly in these areas, it should be most important to build bridges even across divides. And these are areas where science can contribute to solving problems rather than creating problems. and addressing some of the global problems and the global issues like climate change or solving environmental crisis in general, and also addressing other global challenges like fighting poverty, fighting hunger, and so on, can be still continued despite the geopolitical rivalries, and are in the interest of all parties. And for that reason, I think it's very important to use this collaboration, which is long established among researchers of conflict parties, that can be used. And there are some existing bodies, in particular in climate science, that can be still used, like the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the Climate Convention, the Paris Treaty. And these negotiation bodies in these areas are still continuing. I mean, the IPCC is still working despite the war. The UN Framework Convention is still working, and on Biodiversity Convention is still working. And in all these are scientists participating, but also non-scientists participating. And these include Russian scientists as well as Ukrainian scientists. And here they're still working together in these areas, and we could still build on this collaboration to strengthen at least some of links in a positive direction. We should also keep in mind that it's very important to keep collaboration with Russian climate scientists, simply because Russia is very important as the largest country in the world, in the northern hemisphere, which is on the one hand causing some of the problems, but also could contribute to solving these problems. Keep in mind that, for instance, the soils in Siberia, which is a very large area, could lead to the emission of methane and other greenhouse gases. And if this continues uncontrolled and unchecked, that is a disaster for the world. As well, the same for the Arctic region, where they have the ice melting, and the warm Arctic Ocean could be also a possible disaster for the world. And there have been long-established collaborations with Russian scientists in measuring these processes, both the release of methane and the melting Arctic Ocean, and interrupting the measurements. There have been long-term measurements over years and decades. That means there is a gap in measuring, and that alone can be very devastating. So we should, at least for the common interest of the planet, keep these activities going on. It would be really stupid also for the Western countries, for short-sighted interest, to undermine the long-term common interest, which are very important in the common house of planet Earth. And this is just a very important suggestion to keep this going on, to avoid some of the tipping points in which Russia could be possibly involved in the climate system. Okay, this is just a very important aspect only for the climate science. We can make the same cases for other fields of research in biodiversity research. So there have been also some projects involving indigenous people in Russia and other parts of the Arctic region, which all should be continued. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to boycott the indigenous researchers in this region. Why should we boycott them? I mean, they also have problems with their administration and the government. But if we weaken their position in Russia, that is certainly not in our interest. So we should make very strong cases for having at least a minimum research going on. And the question is how far this minimum can be extended. This is something that can be further discussed to keep some of the research networks going on. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think it's sobering to think that, okay, it's one thing if it takes a bit longer to discover supersymmetry because of the lack of international collaboration. But if we lose our monitoring of the Arctic climate, then we're really in trouble. Okay, so now I'd like to call upon you, Ernst Weizsäcker. You're a physicist who became a biologist, environmental science, and you were co-president for many years of the Club of Rome. Please give us your wisdom. I think you're muted.
You hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks for mentioning the Club of Rome. I mean, the Club of Rome is an organization in which the very idea of sanctions on science is not any discussion, not worth any discussion. I mean, it was created in the late 1960s when the first practical dissolution of the Cold War was the aim of scientists worldwide thinking that we should overcome the kind of Cold War, including perhaps sanctions. And so one very important institute was created, the IASA, International Institute for Advanced Systems Analysis, near Vienna, and Russia was there, and the USA were there, and everybody, more or less, and they wanted together to work on what can we do jointly and helping in a peaceful way countries to cooperate instead of just rivaling. I mean, what I found particularly stupid was what President Donald Trump always said: the function of nations is be rivals against everybody else, which is crazy, isn't it? But this was his language. So the IASA, or the Club of Rome, and many others, of course, the IPPNW, etc., had the opposite view of working together. And then, of course, under war conditions, you can come up with the idea, well, maybe the enemy should not know about atomic bombs, etc., etc. And that can lead to sanctions, but they never really worked. Well, so much for that. The question is, of course, in the political West, in response to the Russian attack to Ukraine, people began to think that we have to isolate Russia and no longer, well, buy Russian natural gas and many other things, and also not let them know what we are doing that is important for winning the war. But I believe the scientific communities of the West have never really thought that this was their duty. Rather, they felt the best point is coming back to the pre-war situation in Russia at the time of Gorbachev, etc., who he wanted cooperation instead of the kind of stupid things Mr. Putin is doing. So what can I say? As a scientist, I'm fully on the path of cooperation, of helping each other, of understanding what Jürgen just said about climate, what can we do, and overcoming the kind of rivalry which essentially leads to more destruction and less cooperation.
Okay, so thanks very much for those very wise words. So I think now we've heard from everybody in the panel, and I'd like to get some discussion going on between you on a few issues. So I think that we all agree, at least all the participants, all the people who've spoken have agreed they don't want politics to influence scientific cooperation. But the question is, how do we progress? How do we get to a more positive future than the current situation? And so a few questions for you from Hannes. How important is still the Science for Peace idea? Is it still relevant? What can we do? What's the difference between this and previous wars? So we mentioned the Cold War, when there wasn't the same degree of isolation that is now being imposed on Russia and Belarus. Could also mention the Iraq War, where there was no isolation of the United States and other countries participating in the invasion of Iraq. How do we get back to general scientific and cultural cooperation? How do we de-escalate? How do we prepare the way for building bridges again? How do we remove the sanctions in science, sports, and culture? So does anybody want to step forward with some concrete ideas as to how to proceed?
Perhaps I can suggest that Götz Neuneck says something about Pugwash, because Pugwash was also a very early group of people from the Soviet Union and the USA and then Canada and many others to cooperate instead of just fight against each other.
Okay, Götz, would you like to respond to that challenge?
Thank you for this kind invitation from Ernst. Of course, I mean, my personal view, what scientists can do is to study and to articulate better what damage is done to science if this situation continues. I don't have the means and overview to do that, but scientists can see that day by day their work. And I think politics should understand that even it is meant maybe for symbolic reason that it's hurting, it is cutting developments. So that would be my personal advice, and to speak more to politicians, to the parliamentarians, to the ministries would be important. If no one is articulating it, then the bureaucracy thinks we can go on with that situation for a long time, and I think that would be wrong. The hint to the Cold War is, of course, important. The Cold War was a different configuration. Pugwash started in '57, and it lasted for a long time, all the confidential debates, but it was focusing on specific things such as weapons of mass destruction, nuclear testing, where a lot of scientific expertise is really necessary. And that continued for a quite long time. Now, the Russian colleagues are, of course, like in UPAP or IPPNW, are still there, and we can talk to them. But it is, of course, harder to do now because there are also defenders of the war. I mean, you have to understand the history before the war. to come to a solution to the war, and everyone should try to find ways for a ceasefire, for transforming this situation again to some kind of stable peace order. And I can assure you that we actually try to do that. But PAKVOŠ was always working in a confidential way, and it's in a time of Twitter and a lot of public campaigns, not the right place to talk about that, and that will last time. Also, PAKVOŠ needed a lot of time to build trust. Even the famous scientists needed some time to got confidence to each other, to develop ideas, and that worked. And I can only encourage people to study this kind of history, which goes far beyond my own experiences. So it started in the 60s, and it went through different waves. And I think scientists in all institutions know their Russian colleagues, and they should try by themselves to find ways how to rebuild the trust which is lost. And then we are come to the question how to de-escalate in a situation where the public is mostly speaking about military effects, and that the military logic is prevailing here. But the starting question by Hannes, is science for peace still relevant? Yes. I mean, we will come back to some kind of peace agreement. The only question is when and how long this would last. And of course, science can contribute to that prior to this situation, but also later on. I mean, Ukraine, parts of Ukraine are in ruins, and science in the Ukraine needs help. But also, I think Russian scientists, even if they defend the invasion, are unhappy with the situation. And I think the peace thoughts are important. If you give that up, then we live really in a different world. And we built up during the Cold War a lot of regulations, a lot of treaties, which have been lost in the last 5 or 10 years, simply because of ignorance, a lack of knowledge, and also science was no longer focusing so much on this, because everyone thought we will solve all this and we live in the 21st century in a peaceful world. But you know that this is not the case. And Ukraine is maybe a symbol for a fight also about a new world order. It is important also to understand the views of other scientists, non-Russian, non-European scientists, about the Ukrainian war. Because in the Western media, many people based on the liberal thinking think that this war is, very clear. But if you speak with Brazilians, with Indians, with the global South, they have a different view. And it's not only about Russia, it's also about the West and the coming up of this geopolitical rivalry. And scientists are not trained in these kinds of somewhat political dialogues. And also PAKVOŠ scientists, not from the beginning, famous people participating in this, were not specialists in politics, but they had a high level of trust to their Russian colleagues, and they started this dialogue. And you need patience for it, and should not give up some lessons, and hopefully we come back much faster to some solutions. And we think actually, because we only focus on the military logic.
Okay.
So sorry, very long answer, but this I think covered some of the questions. And thank you for Ernst for mentioning PAKVOŠ again. I mean, IPPNW has this more or less the same experiences. These are different audiences. I mean, the medicine, surgeons, physicians have a different outreach. Physics too, but we should combine maybe also our forces here, including science, to find new ways how to handle the situation.
Okay, thank you, Gers. So I see there's several other members of the panel who would like to say a few words. Natasha. You should unmute.
Yes. Okay. So thank you. Definitely any sanctions themselves put the country in a difficult situation. And actually, I'm very afraid that after all, they give the greatest impact and consequences in science and culture, because during the recovery after the political and economic sanctions, the country actually solves the most urgent problems, and I'm afraid that the collapsed science and culture will wait for their recovery for a long time. Continuing on God's idea, I think that we should emphasize and light all the good examples that were present that are present in science and that are still there. In this place, I would like to mention the multi-year project SESME, which started officially working in 2017 and has been implemented in Jordan and represents the true center of science nowadays. And actually, it was supported by CERN with one of the main aims to use science as a way to learn together in the Middle East. SESME is actually the shortness for synchrotron light for experimental science and applications in the Middle East. It was established under the auspices of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and as a Science for Peace project. So they are projects that are developed with one of the main aims of building scientific and cultural bridges between participating countries and strengthening mutual understanding and tolerance through international cooperations and collaborations between people who are recently or currently in conflict. And we know that this works. And why should one go and spoil scientific collaboration, for example, which as a particle physics collaborations which are built and function on the solid grounds for many years, thanks to the dedication of scientists who actually take great care of this. And I think that such collaboration should not be sensitive to the too many injustices, violation of rights and wars we have been seeing around. And the big centers that make the decision should understand it very well.
Okay, so thank you, Natasha, for reminding us about Sesame. Sesame is in some sense a child of CERN, as you said. And I know there you have foes like Israel and Iran and Palestine, sitting around a table and collaborating scientifically. And it's somewhat ironic that they continue to do so, whereas at CERN, Russia has been ejected from the council table. Chuck, I think you were the next one to put your hand up.
Yeah, that is really an excellent example, and the fact that it should be cited by us repeatedly as an example of how this can happen, and we don't have to automatically have this knee-jerk reaction of immediate sanctions. The thing that I would say is that I think we've now seen different groups talk about put out petitions similar to the one that Science4Peace put out. There's a group of Princeton scientists who put one out recently. We have IPPNW, we've got Pugwash, we've got a number of different organizations that are out here that sort of think similarly. And I think we need to maybe consider organized action in the case that I talked about. The American National Academy of Sciences is one place where a debate needs to take place, and probably some other European equivalents of that where we ought to see if there's support among some of the leadership in those organizations, and marshal the most persuasive and prestigious people we can find to then advocate for against this blanket shutdown of contact, and advocate for reopening it, maybe with some exceptions in terms of obviously studying things that are of military use, just simply because, you know, that's a tough argument to make, that you don't at least consider that. But I would suggest that Science for Peace and other people who are on this call consider doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. So I'd just like to remark that in the UK, I was involved in efforts to persuade our National Academy, namely the Royal Society, to take a line against cutting scientific relations with Russia. And I have to say, we were not very successful. Sasha.
Right, so thanks, John. Yeah, so first of all, I would like to pick up on this difference in the situation which we had in the Cold War and now. So, I mean, in the Cold War, the partnership and the movement and our connections between scientists, starting from 60s and then 70s, that came after total isolation of the Soviet Union. So any discussion was actually good, even if you would get the two scientists and the KGB guy together. So talking to them was very useful still. Right? And I believe this is what brought understanding that there is no need to compete, right? And the Gorbachev came. So that was extremely good. But we are in a different situation. I mean, we talk about scientists who sometimes all scientific career from the early 90s participate in the collaboration and worked at CERN or our institutions. And I mean, they are all engaged in the world scientific community. And suddenly we got them all. So this is, I think, so it's really a misguided target. So I think we should try to propagate this knowledge that these are not the scientists working on the war, not the scientists who support the war. And okay, there is a common discussion about dual usage, and that's of course very important point. But again, so this is the situation is these are different people. So people who publish in open journals, they don't work on war. I don't know if you read news. Sometimes there are Russian scientists convicted for some espionage for China or for the United States, and then the charges are how they leaked certain secrets, and they're actually afraid to. These people are afraid to publish in open source journals because of this, for these reasons. So if the person publishes in open source, it's almost guaranteed he is a reasonable person. Yeah, so I think the knowledge that we target the wrong set of people should be propagated. So one more point, which I think is also extremely important. So it's a reaction of Ukrainians. So of course, we need to help Ukraine as much as possible to rebuild and recover. But so at the moment, the situation is such that they take, so there is a call for kind of a total war with also in science. So people, Ukrainians, individuals, they refuse to sign with Russians sometimes, and there are petitions with thousands of people signing. And I'm afraid this is one of the worst situations, and I don't know how to deal with that, but I think this is what we need to talk about and try to avoid this as much as possible, because I think cooperation and ties is the only way forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. Michel.
Thank you, John. I want to take a point to elaborate upon what said Jürgen before. It's true that we are facing frightening global challenges like climate change, loss of biodiversity, water, food, health, and more generally, we have in front of us the Sustainable Goals agenda. But these global challenges At the same time, we know that they need global responses. They could be an opportunity to promote global collaborations. In fact, already, so for IUPAP took the lead in the proclamation of the International Year of Basic Sciences for Sustainable Development in 2023. We are now continuing by taking the lead in promoting a decade of sciences for sustainability, which could allow a global mobilization of scientists and search for and look for a better organization of all sciences for sustainability, which in fact could contribute to be a way out of these sanctions against sciences, because this will mobilize almost all the scientific community. So maybe it's a dream, but the challenges that we have in front of us could be the way out of these sanctions and difficulty to collaborate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Michel. Yeah, in fact, Chuck just echoed what you said. Sustainability is a good value drive. So maybe we can collaborate on net zero, if nothing else. Okay, are there any others on the panel who got something they want to get off their chest? Or perhaps the time has come to open up the discussion to other participants in the call.
Of students of the University of Hamburg has asked for the floor.
Yeah, so I'm happy to hand it over to you. I think this is the right one. I'll ask you to unmute.
Good evening. Tobias Berking is my name.
Hi, Tobias. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, you can hear me. That's great. I think most people can only lose in the war, and so it's not very easy to convince them to take part in it. I think if there is in fact a civil cooperation for a good development, for a balance of interests, it would be even harder to get people to take part in a war. I think it could be that the main function of the sanctions is that this development, this cooperation for a good development, does not come to be fact. I think if this is the main function of the sanctions, we should enlighten that there are possibilities for a good development, for a peaceful development for all the countries, and that we, the people, especially the scientists, can bring a lot to bring this in the world, or that the people know how to do that. The cooperation, I think, is the way to achieve this, and the stop of cooperation is to that one does not, is therefore that people do not see it is already possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Tobias. So I also see a hand raised by Uta Amer.
Good evening. First, I wanted to say that I very much appreciate and I congratulate Natasha said that sanctions became a little bit weaker because of the petition. And this is fantastic, I think. Then I wanted to point out, please, sitting a bit in an ivory tower, members of parliament are not closely related to science and might have advisors following partly their maybe also lobby interests. So I would advise to include them in your peace-containing thoughts and take them a little bit by the hand. In Germany, it is quite easy to have appointments with them, as they are regularly present in the election districts. They are the ones to decide on sanctions. And it would be also helpful to stay in contact with the mass media and also to talk about this to everybody. If somebody signs the petition, also send it to your relatives, to your friends. Talk with all people you meet about this theme. And yes, I will end now. The logic of war may not be allowed to influence and affect the civil development. It is very important to point this out. I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rita. So, I see a hand raised by Anatoly Obzhirov. So if you'd like to, yeah.
Yeah, hello, thank you for organizing this panel. So you have discussed on the panel many points related to sanctions, one of which was what is the aim of sanctions, what is the purpose of them. And one of the ideas was that it is a signal and, to people living, for example, in the country. And in this regard, I would like to say that, actually, so there is army in Ukraine, but actually there is much larger army in Russia to control people and have a very strong grip on people's beliefs and comments. A lot of people went to jails, sometimes on very stupid things, like a daughter writes in a school anti-war picture and her father goes to jail. And situation in Russia is very severe. And then people discuss sanctions against Russia, Russian science, and closing collaboration with Russian scientists. One point which they need to keep in mind is that it's very intense inside Russia, and people clearly understand how situation is bad. But all political leaders, they're either killed or in jail. So there was Boris Nemtsov, which was killed in front of Kremlin. His killer is now in Ukraine, leading one of the group of armed warriors. Another journalist, she was killed exactly at the day of Putin's birthday. So these sanctions, so people which are inside Russia, they realize they do not need any signal like that, because there are a lot of signals coming inside Russia. And that people also need some kind maybe of help and assistance, because they are also in a very difficult situation. And it is not clear at all how to fight it, because going against the war is like committing suicide in current situation. So maybe also keep in mind that these people also need some kind of help and assistance.
Okay, Anatoly, thank you for reminding us of these complex issues. So I see that Ahmed Ali has got his hand raised, but if you don't mind, Ahmed, I'd just like to pick up something from the chat window, which I think there's a couple of interesting points there. So one is the contradiction between the fact that we don't want politics to influence scientific cooperation, but we also want scientific cooperation to influence politics. Is there a contradiction there? Does somebody on the panel want to react to that thought?
Take the floor for a moment. I was member of parliament in the German parliament, and I must say the typical public critique of politics is basically wrong. We, as members of parliament, have been extremely interested in what scientists has to say. And we had lots of meetings with the scientists, but it is always quite comfortable to put all the critique on politics.
Okay, well, thank you for reminding us of our responsibility to engage with politicians. Also, the point made previously, I think, was by Uta. Another point I'd like to pick up from the chat is from Rohini Godbole, who thanks Gert for mentioning that the way non-Europeans, Brazilians, Indians, etc., look at this war on sanctions is quite different. And that she says that she was happy how in the past CERN was instrumental in scientific diplomacy. And we definitely need how we can try to use scientific collaboration to influence politics. So I don't know whether Rohini is still on the call or whether she or possibly Ahmed would like to comment on how this conflict between Russia and Western countries is seen in the global South.
Yeah, maybe Rohini will, if she's there, can comment on this better from the point of view of India. But I can understand, I mean, that this war is going on the European continent, and those countries and from the European continent are directly affected. And therefore, although there have been wars, there have been more terrible wars, like the war in Vietnam, also the war in Iraq. But the European condemnation or reaction to those wars was rather lukewarm. So I think this is the point of view which I think is also being raised by Rohini. Now, if you allow me a minute, I would like to say that things are changing in terms of scientific collaboration. More specifically, I think what concerns me and many working scientists is the issue of publications. And I was quite pleasantly surprised today reading in the archive a paper put out by the Jefferson collaboration, GLUX collaboration, in which all the names of the scientists, including Russian scientists, and their institutional affiliations, including Kurchatov Institute, which is a red flag. All of those are mentioned, and all the various organizations which have supported this research are thanked in acknowledgement. At a somewhat personal level, we also issued from DESY a paper 2 weeks ago, in which two young Russian scientists were involved, are co-authors, and the DESY directorate, under some conditions, agreed to issue that paper. It's on the archive. So I would like to say that what concerns this forum, and particularly what concerns me, it is these direct matters which influences our scientific activity, our collaboration, the ability to communicate, write papers, that is at the core of the problem. And I think that a fora like the present one are making a difference, and they are now in various forms. Papers are now being issued, because I would like to say that I mean, Russia is a very big country. It's almost a continent. It's about a seventh of the Earth's area. There was life, all kinds of life, cultural, scientific, personal, before the war. And I can assure you it will remain so after the war. So I think we should not forget that aspect, that at some point we will have to pick up these connections and collaborations again. And the earlier, the better. And I think that fora like this one, or institutes like DESY and CERN and Jefferson Lab and others, they are actually very well poised. And in the end, I would say I was moved by many, many speakers today, but in particular by Michel Spiro when he said that scientific collaboration as driver of peace. And this is, I think, what it's all about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. So, Hannes, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks very much for all the contributions. I would like to pick up on 2 points. One is, how can we change the present situation of sanctions in science? And this is particularly important because it is actually we who decide what we do in science and how we publish and how we treat publications. And I'm a bit shocked on how some of our colleagues are treating the whole issue, and I didn't expect this before the beginning of the war, and I'm a bit shocked how people easily accept these sanctions in science. And I have no good idea how we can change that, but I want to bring that up. Maybe somebody has a good idea how we can change that, because at the end, it's us and our colleagues who decide how we treat publications, how we treat our colleagues from different countries. And the other point I would like to pick up is what Michel also said, is on young scientists and on schools. It has been that at the CERN school and also at the DESY summer school, Russian scientists or Russian students are not accepted. And this is, I find, really a disaster, because that would be a possibility to bring young people together who have nothing to do with the decision of the war, and to bring them together with other people to discuss and to exchange ideas and to exchange thoughts on physics, but also on politics. And I was wondering whether there could be a chance for us to promote, to get started on schools which explicitly would allow the participation of people from every country to get back the idea of science for peace, especially for young students. And I would be very interested to hear how we can establish something like that, then that we can build up schools, or then that we can change the policy of the laboratories to allow people from all countries to participate in the schools. Thanks a lot.
So thank you, Hannes. I think that's a very good suggestion. Actually, what was it, 2 weeks ago, I participated in a CERN school that was held in Latin America. And I talked to the organizers. I wanted to understand what was the situation with regard to Russian student participation in CERN physics schools. And I was told that although the formal collaboration with JINR was paused, it was still in principle possible for Russian students to come if their expenses were paid for by some external source. So I guess that might be their home institute, maybe it might be IUPAP, I don't know. But I think it would be good to clarify what the policy is and work towards loosening it as far as possible.
IUPAP is ready to help, John.
Yeah, okay, so maybe we could follow up on Hannes's suggestion and work with CERN and also DESY and other organizations that hold international schools, and try to at least make it possible for students to participate.
Yes.
And actually, I see a suggestion in the chat window from Zlatka Stajkova that the DPG back in the 2000s had a fund for sponsoring young people from the East. That would also be a line worth following. So thank you for that suggestion, Hans. So I don't see any other hands raised. I don't see any other points in the chat. Yes, I do. Sonia Brenches, please.
Yeah. Since the at least German science organizations like the German Science Foundation or Humboldt Foundation, etc., have all taken to the sanction regime on a very broad basis, not just in science. And since you said that in the Royal Society, there was not much positive response to your efforts, I wonder whether, in addition to cooperating between the different organizations present today in the panel, one should think about trying to get into a conversation with the leadership of these European science organizations to see in which directions one could move them or with them in order to lower the sanction regimes, if not to abandon it completely. So that would be one question that I would have to the panel. Do you think that it is possible to get in this kind of conversation?
Yeah, I don't know. Michelle, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, not particularly.
Oh. Okay. You know what? I think that while this call's been very interesting, and I think there's lots of points that we want to take up in the future, we've been on the call now for a couple of hours, and maybe now is the time to gently wind it up. Unless people object strongly, I don't see any obvious objections. So what I would like to do is, first of all, thank all the panelists for your active participation and all your interventions. I think you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you very much. And I would also like to thank Hannes very much for bringing us all together and setting up this meeting, and also Wissenschaft.
So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, John, for this excellent moderation.
Well, I did the best that I could, but it was the raw materials that really made the thing work. So thanks very much. Anyway, I just wanted to thank also Wissenschaft Frieden for their co-sponsoring of this meeting. And I think I'll hand it back now to Hannes to close.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, John, for taking really the load of chairing this session and this meeting. I think it was excellent. Thanks very much. And thanks also to all the panelists who gave very important, very interesting and very good suggestions and comments to how we can proceed. I think it was a very good and very fruitful discussion, and I would like to thank everybody who joined the session today for joining and making that possible. Thanks very much and have a nice...
Natasha, you want to say something, Natasha?
Right, please, Natasha.
Yes, I would like to say something, and I would like to say that Science4Peace Forum, through all the meetings, had propagated the ideas that we're discussing today. They were triggering attention of the leading management in scientific organization, and I consider the Science4Peace Forum very effective and successful in its mission. So from this place, I would like to thank and to congratulate Hannes Jung, his team and collaborators for all what has been done from that side, and wish them to keep going in promoting this great idea, which is indeed rather natural, and that is connection of science and also culture and peace. So thank you very much. And thank you, John. It was excellent mediation.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for these very nice words. We will keep on going with the Science for Peace idea. And thanks again, John, for the very good moderation. And I think we are now ready to close the meeting today. The meeting is recorded. We will make it public on our webpage. I will send a mail to all participants around when it is ready, and then you can watch the discussion again and again. Thanks very much for joining today, and have a nice evening, night, or morning. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Vielen Dank, Hannes. Weiterhin viel Kraft.
Danke. Ciao.